Hi, I'm Chris Martin. I'm here in the Martin Museum, and behind me is the section of the museum dedicated to what people refer to as our golden era. And today I'm going to talk about the D-45, the top of the line, the holy grail. The first D-45 we built was made for Gene Autry. And in fact, we have some of the correspondence on display here in the museum between Gene and my grandfather. I had always wanted to see that guitar. And lo and behold, it's on display in Gene's museum. I didn't know he had a museum, but he does. It's actually a wonderful facility. And if you ever get a chance and you're in Los Angeles, go over to Griffith Park and visit Gene Autry's museum. Part of the museum is dedicated to the history of the singing cowboy, and part of the museum is dedicated to some real, authentic Western memorabilia. When we built this museum, we realized that one of the missing links, probably the most significant missing link, was the D-45. We didn't have one. You know, when my family built them back in the 30s and 40s, they never thought, gee, maybe someday there'll be a museum and we should keep one of these. So we sold them all. It was cash flow. And of course, over time, they've become more and more and more and more valuable. A couple of points in my career, I had the opportunity to buy one. And I always said to myself, boy, that's a lot of money. And I think that money could be better spent on raw materials, on training, on more fixturing. And the next time I came across a D-45 for sale, it cost more than the previous time. Well, we finally decided we've got to bite the bullet and get a D-45. So we put the word out, and we got a call from Fred Oster. He said, I have that D-45. I said, okay. And now, remember, back in the day, the D-45 cost less than the F9. I said, well, how much is the D-45? He said, well, the owner, and I'm brokering it for the owner with a partner, he wants $285,000 for it. Yeah, there was a pause, and I, took a deep breath and said, oh, okay. And I knew that's what they're going for today, if you can find one. I've been around about a half a dozen of them in my life. And so I called my core team together, the officers of the company, because this was a big, expensive decision. And there was the guitar, there was the core team, there was Fred, and I said, this could be ours. And I told them the price, and of course they all gasped. And then Fred Green picked the guitar up and strummed it and curled up around the guitar. And that's when I realized that that guitar was worth it. It's possibly, and it's just my opinion, the best sounding vintage Martin guitar I've ever heard. We've made historical reproductions of many of our popular models. We've got the Vintage series and the Golden Era series. A couple years ago, I said to myself, why don't we make an authentic reproduction of a vintage Martin guitar? And of course, there's a lot of discussion about, well, Chris, some of the changes that occurred over time were done because of issues that occurred with the old guitars. For example, today we put the pickguard over the finish because that doesn't cause a little crack that can occur if the pickguard shrinks and the top moves in the opposite direction, you get a little what's called pickguard crack. Today we use an adjustable truss rod to allow you, if you are inclined to move around with your guitar and expose it to different climates, to make minor adjustments to the neck. The veneers are actually a little thicker today than they were back. You think back in the 1930s, we had only been making steel string guitars at that point for about 10 years. And we were still learning, how much structure does a guitar need in order to accommodate those steel strings for the lifetime of the instrument and the original owner. So we started out by discussing the possibility of making an authentic reproduction of a D18. We thought that would be kind of a good base model to start with. And we did a lot of research. We gathered information. We gathered some old D18s, and they varied. They weren't all as consistent back then as they are today. But we came up with the idea of, okay, these are going to be this is going to be the specifications for this guitar. And it turned out to be a very successful new product introduction for us. One of the reasons is that the old ones, even D18s, they're very expensive. Owners are reluctant to part with them, and when they do, they ask a lot of money for them. Not everybody can afford a $40,000 used guitar. And so, for someone who wants a Martin and wants an authentic reproduction of a vintage Martin guitar, who better to buy it from than the Martin Guitar Company? some of the things we do with the authentic models is we use hide glue. That's what we used back in the day. So, the D-45, it seemed appropriate. Now, bear in mind that we started this project the idea of the project prior to the Great Recession. And it takes a long time to have a project like this come to fruition. But we took the D-45 that is in our collection, 1942 D-45, and made, I think, a valiant attempt to reproduce it, to make a modern version of this particular Martin guitar that's in our collection. And we introduced it at the trade show in Anaheim, and I think I remember someone saying to me, oh, maybe we'll sell one. And I thought to myself, I think we're going to sell more than one. Now, granted, the economy's not as strong as it was a couple of years ago, but I said, I still think there are people out there that, first of all, the vintage ones are very difficult to find. And when you do, they're still, old Martin guitars haven't come down in price nearly as much as old electric guitars. In fact, Vintage Guitar Magazine recently came out with a list of the top 25 most valuable guitars, and the vintage Martin D-45 was number one. It has held its value better than any other vintage instrument. So I'd like my colleague, Gary Lambert, who was very involved in the analysis of the pre-war D-45 on display in our museum, and then the transformation of that information into a specification sheet and the actual construction of this prototype D-45 Authentic, to talk to you about the specifications and what makes this guitar so unique.
Hi, I'm Gary Lambert. I work here at Martin Guitar with research and development, and was one of many individuals involved in the specifications for the D-45 Authentic. We tried to recreate as true as possible many features on the D-45, and a few of those I'd like to point out. We did try to keep top, back, side thicknesses very similar to thicknesses that we would find on the 1942 Authentic. We also used solid pearl throughout the instrument for the top, back, side pearl, the pearl in the head plate, and the pearl in the fingerboard. And we also tried to authenticate the bracing pattern. It's a rear shifted bracing pattern that we used back in the early 40s. We also incorporated a ebony truss rod in the neck. Back in the early 40s during the war effort, we were limited to the amount of metal that we were using, so we switched from a metal T-bar truss rod to an ebony truss rod. And we finished this whole instrument in a very thin finish package that we do just on this particular instrument, basically to help enhance the sound even more.
Well, I hope you get a chance to come and visit us, take the factory tour, spend some time in the museum, check out our 1942 D-45, which is on display, along with a couple of other Golden Era Dreadnoughts and some Golden Era Orchestra Model Triple O's. I really look forward to seeing you here in Nazareth. Thanks.